believe state media, Russia has been more successful in beating coronavirus than almost any other country in the world.
Ситуация находится под полным контролем.
The country supposedly has one of the lowest coronavirus death rates relative to its level of infection in the world. But leading doctors claim the official figures are lies.
Больше происходит вранья и подтасовки каких-то данных, тем больше страдают и сами люди.
The handling of the pandemic has drawn comparisons with the cover-up following the Chernobyl nuclear disaster.
It took the Kremlin leadership more than 2 weeks to face up to the problem.
Putin remembers very well what happened after Chernobyl, the collapse of the Soviet Union. His absolute #1 aim is to avoid that scenario.
Mr. Putin's handling of the pandemic has led to the lowest popularity rating of his presidency. Will COVID-19 undermine his grip on power? Russia has the third highest level of coronavirus infection in the world. But according to official figures, the number of people who have died of the virus is remarkably low.
The fatality rate in Russia, as Russian officials themselves trumpet, is 7.5 times lower than the rest of the world. But we cannot trust the official figures.
These startling images show just how overstretched its health service has become.
Medics on the ground have long suspected many more people are dying. And in defiance of the government, a group of doctors has compiled what they're calling a memory list, which names their colleagues who have died on the front line treating patients with COVID-19.
В России гибнет довольно много медицинских работников, и мы видим, что нет никаких официальных данных об этом, и эта проблема как будто не существует для руководителя того, чтобы в каждой точке страны были готовы к борьбе с эпидемией. Нужна абсолютная правда об этой эпидемии.
Local journalists using the memory list found the mortality rate among frontline healthcare workers in Russia to be 16 times higher than in countries with a similar infection rate. But these deaths don't show up in official numbers because they're not being properly recorded.
Во многих больницах администрация не тестирует своих сотрудников на коронавирус. Медики погибают якобы от других причин, от пневмонии, да? Хотя, конечно, почти несомненно коронавирусная смерть.
Russia is the biggest country in the world. It spans 11 time zones. And the memory list is now one of the main indicators that the official figures do not reflect the scale of the problem. It's even being used by some government agencies in the absence of reliable statistics.
This could be quite a scary moment for Putin. It's extraordinary, not just in terms of the window into the official lies. It's extraordinary in terms of the sense of a building responsibility in civil society, which works counter to the authoritarian instincts of the Kremlin.
It's not just doctors breaking rank to report the truth. In May, in Dagestan, in Russia's North Caucasus, the health minister told local media that the number of infections was 4 times higher than reported.
От внебольничной пневмонии это 657.
Уже 657 человек.
Да, к сожалению, так.
Although, at the time, only 29 people had officially died from coronavirus, hundreds more had mysteriously passed away with pneumonia. The ministers suspected most of these deaths were caused by COVID-19.
That produced immediate reaction from Putin, who had to go on television, say, okay, to admit that there is a serious situation in Dagestan.
В Дагестане ситуация складывается сейчас непросто.
Occasionally, this sort of picture of being in control and defeating the virus starts breaking out, and you see through the cracks that the figures are not real.
Following an outcry in local independent and foreign press about the misleading statistics, the city of Moscow also had to admit that the number of COVID-related deaths was 2.5 times higher than it had previously reported. In the early days of the outbreak, Putin didn't announce a nationwide lockdown, but declared paid non-working days, which many mistook for time off.
Next week, the entire country, apart from those working essential services, will effectively have a week of holiday.
He left it to regional authorities to impose restrictions.
You would expect an authoritarian ruler to be very much at the center of the crisis, managing it. No, Putin actually withdrew from it, not wanting to be tainted by it and not wanting to catch the blame. From the lockdown, he is trying to be the crowd pleaser, because the biggest number you care about is your rating, not the rate of infection.
Regional leaders were keen to prove they were controlling the disease and duly reported low infection rates to the Kremlin. But the numbers didn't add up.
I think it's absolutely reasonable to assume that the Kremlin might not know the real figures. And this is the most dangerous situation, where the Kremlin itself doesn't get the real data. And therefore its responses and its policy decisions are going to be wrong because they're based on the wrong data.
This situation reminds some observers of another dark period in Russian history.
Chernobyl has claimed its first victims from radiation.
Perhaps the worst accident in the short history of the world's nuclear power industry.
We know that when Gorbachev was holding those Politburo meetings, he didn't know, the Bureau didn't know what was really happening in Chernobyl. They didn't know the whole station was on fire, the real level of radiation. The local bosses trying to cover their own backs. There is a big difference. That was a man-made disaster. Neither then nor now do I think that people in charge of Russia have reliable data and are therefore acting and making the best policy for the interests of the people based on the best reliable data.
The Chernobyl nuclear disaster led to a shift towards greater transparency in Russia, thanks to Gorbachev's policy of glasnost, or openness.
Putin was a serving KGB officer in 1986. He remembers very well what happened after Chernobyl and what those reforms have led to. The last thing he will want to do is to repeat what he considers to be Gorbachev's mistake, to open up and liberalize the system.
Putin is keen to put the coronavirus pandemic behind him. While parts of the country were still in lockdown, he scheduled a massive military parade for June 24th to mark the 75th anniversary of the Soviet victory over the Nazis.
Hitler planned this as a triumphal march in 1942, when his legions...
Covid-19 meant the original celebration had to be drastically scaled back.
In terms of legitimacy of Putin's regime, that celebration is absolutely critical, and he's been preparing for it for a long time, which is why he was so upset when the COVID kicked in.
Putin hopes to rule Russia for the rest of his life. He's already used the pandemic to increase restrictions on the press and limit protests. And in July, he will hold a vote on a new constitution, which, if passed, would allow him to remain in power until he dies. But his handling of the COVID-19 crisis means his popularity is at an all-time low.
My fear is that Putin will try to compensate the fallen popularity, not by opening up the country and liberalizing it, but by cracking down further. And there are certainly worrying signs of that already happening.
In his bid to shore up his power, there's a risk Putin will become more repressive. And this will have consequences that could stretch far beyond the pandemic. It will make the peaceful transfer of power in Russia more unlikely, and leave the country's future looking more unpredictable and violent, which is a concern, not just to its own citizens, but the whole world.
I'm Arkady Ostrovsky, and I'm the Russia editor at The Economist. If you'd like to read more about COVID-19, its impact on the world politics, and on Russia in particular, you can click on the link opposite.